Is Joe Biden coming for your children?
Welcome to Answers News for Monday, May 1st, 2023.
Hello, I'm Avery Foley, and I'm here with Roger Patterson and Dr. Jennifer Rivera. And today we'll be discussing a horrifying statement made by President Biden in addition to some other news stories. So let's start with critics shred Biden for claiming our nation's children are all our children. Absolutely wrong. So this is coming from Fox News, talking about a statement that President Biden made recently during a ceremony that was honoring the National and State Teachers of the Year. And he quoted a teacher in saying, "There is no such thing as someone else's child. Our nation's children are all our children." And that made a few people a little bit upset because such a statement like that collectivist idea that children don't belong to parents, they belong to ultimately the state, the government, is a really dangerous ideology that's rooted in really communistic thinking about families and children.
Yeah, it really is. I can think back to being trained as an educator back in college. That was kind of the philosophy that came out of the thinking of John Dewey and others. They're trying to think about public education as a way to make everybody the same. It's a collectivist idea that everybody's going to be trained up the same way, so everybody has the same ideals. One of the doctrines that they tried to think of is called in loco parentis. So when you send your kids to a public school, they're no longer your kids. The state becomes the parent during that time. And you think about the state having control. And like you said, that's kind of the idea that we get from a communist ideology or a socialist ideology. And so when we hear an American president saying something like that, it's very shocking. But this isn't the first time we've heard words like this coming from representatives and other people, even commentators and in various news sites and things. So it's still shocking to hear, not the first time, but it's not a true statement and not something that we can accept, especially from a biblical worldview.
Absolutely, because the Bible is clear that parents are responsible for the upbringing of their children. It mentions in the Bible numerous times, fathers, how they should direct their children. And Deuteronomy 6, I think, is one of the greatest testaments we have in the Bible to how parents are responsible for teaching their children from when they wake up to when they go to sleep, to when we're walking, talking, whatever we're doing. We should be consistently training them with the ultimate goal of raising God-fearing children, right? Because we're supposed to pass on that legacy to our children so they can then carry the torch one day. It is definitely not the public school system. And we've seen this so much, especially as we've talked about the transgender narrative and how they're actually trying to tell parents, we know what's best for your children. We have your students all day. Let us take care of them. And this is just more of that.
And they've become the professionals. And if you're the professional, you're the one who knows what's right. And you're the one who should be responsible for those things, not the parents. And it even mentions Hillary Clinton's book, the controversial book and line, "It takes a village." That's the right way to think about it, right, Avery? No.
No.
I don't think she likes that line. She thumbs down on that one.
God didn't give children to a village to raise. He didn't give them to a nation to raise. He gave them to parents. Children are a gift from the Lord, a heritage from the Lord to their parents to raise. And yes, we can get support and encouragement and community from those around us, particularly those in the church around us, to help us in our job. But first of all, we don't give that job, delegate that responsibility off to somebody else, whether that's the public education system, whether that's our church, to do the job of the spiritual upbringing for us. God has given that job to us, and we do that. And we don't need our community coming around us and telling us what's best for our child, because as a parent, no one knows your child better than you do. No one cares about your child as much as you, at least that should be the case. So you as a parent are the one who's the best equipped to know what's best for your children. And this kind of thinking easily leads to parents being really considered the enemy. Because if children belong to the government, if they belong to the community, well, then the children should think according to the way the community thinks. They should have the same values as the community. And when that clashes with what parents are teaching their children, for example, Christians, then the parent becomes the enemy. They're the bad guy that isn't teaching the children the right way of thinking. They're the ones who aren't raising children to follow along good little citizens doing what citizens are supposed to do. And then parents become the enemies. This kind of thinking is really dangerous in a lot of ways.
And the state can then take them away.
Right.
So we can be very, very aware of those things. And back to the idea of cooperating within the church, as we think about that, it doesn't take a village, it takes a family, as Avery mentioned, and then the church coming alongside. We think about the role of elders and teachers and other people within our church families working together. We can assist each other in those roles, and we can have great benefit from helping each other raise our kids and doing that, coming alongside one another in those roles.
All right, our next one. Satanic Temple's Weekend of Blasphemy sells out in Boston. So for those of you who were in Boston recently, you may have been there for this wonderful family-friendly, sold out, just kidding, not family-friendly.
I doubt it was very family.
Sold out event that took place in Boston, which was SatanCon 2023. Yes, there is an event called SatanCon, apparently. And they had, I think you said, over 800 people this year attended this event.
I was curious. I said, well, how many people actually go to this? And so last year in 22, they had like 360 or something. And we think, oh, it's not that many. What's the big deal? But the thing is, they more than doubled this year in attendance. So now they're up over 800 people. And we need to watch this trend, because I would anticipate, because of what we see going on in the culture, we're actually going to see even more of an increase next year.
Because it's not really, like, these people, it's like a parody religion sort of idea. They don't really believe in Satan. They claim they don't really believe or worship Satan. They claim to be like an atheistic group that really, if you look at like the people who are coming to speak and the topics they're speaking on, almost all of them have to do with sexuality and transgenderism and basically just doing whatever you want, which really appeals to the culture of our day and this whole like anti-religion, anti-God, anti-faith
Abortion rights
kind
too,
of thing.
like abortion was one
lots
of
stuff
their
about
big
abortion
agenda.
there.
Yeah, so the official name of this group is the Satanic Temple, and we can rightly think of it as a religious organization, and they file for exemptions under all those things, just like we would think of our Christian denominations doing the same thing. And it is religiously geared, because rather than worshiping God, they're looking to worship something else. And while they will say, "Hail Satan," and they'll say all these types of things, they'll chant those things, they don't actually believe in an actual being called Satan typically. And this is confusing to most people. Why would you call yourself a Satanist if you don't believe that Satan actually exists? And it's this really odd idea. It's really a type of humanistic religion.
I was going to say, they're really worshiping themselves.
Yeah, they're really worshiping themselves.
Self-glorifying themselves and self-glorying their personal needs and what makes me feel better, because that's what a lot of these like presentations they were having
really
were all
is.
about
It really
self-satisfaction. And
what really struck me just reading the intro to the article, calling it a weekend of blasphemy, how can you have blasphemy against God, supposedly, if you don't even believe God exists?
Right.
That's just a nonsense idea.
Yeah.
So right out of the gate,
In their heart of hearts,
they know what's happening.
They know.
And a lot of the seminars that we read about and saw little video clips of as we were researching this, it's really, how do I sear my conscience so that I don't have to, it was a lot of the deconstruction and dealing with the indoctrination.
how do I get rid of the religion in my
upbringing?
upbringing?
How do I get rid of the religion?
Yes.
It's
how do I
sear
sear
my conscience so I don't have to deal with all that morality stuff? Because a lot of the satanic doctrines that come out of Anton LaVey's writings, it's do what makes you feel good without hurting other people, is kind of the summary of the beliefs.
And it's kind of ironic. They would even make this demonstration. They shredded a Bible at the opening ceremony. If you don't believe in God, you don't believe He exists.
Right.
So why would that even be
Right. Why are you
something
so vehemently
significant to you?
opposed to His
Just
word?
ripping the
People are
pages out of the
cheering,
Bible,
whistling, and clapping as she's
saying
ripping up
it's a
this Bible, and
symbol
you're
of
like,
oppression? And I'm thinking the only way you can really have true freedom is in Jesus Christ, right? We
you will
are
not find it in
truly
doing
free.
whatever you want.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is a good reminder that the human heart does it. If you don't worship God, you don't just not worship anything. You're always going to be worshiping something. And this is a great reminder of that. And as these kinds of things start to grow in our culture and become more and more prominent, that's just a reminder to us as Christians that people don't just worship nothing. They will always have something on the throne of their heart. And it's usually going to be self. And that's what you see here, is just this worship of self in the name of worshiping a Satan they don't believe in, kind of thing.
Yep. Now, if you'd like a little more information about Satanism, the modern form of it, this book series, it's a 3-volume set, World Religions and Cults. Myself and Bodie Hodge were the general editors of this. We've got over 60 authors doing different chapters.
I have an appendix in one of them.
It's on Answers TV too, I believe.
Yeah, a lot
Yes, it's on
of the
Answers TV.
talks, the video forms, these are on our Answers TV platform. Volume 1, Counterfeits of Christianity, Chapter 13 deals with the modern Satanistic movement and talks through some of that, help you think through some of those issues, because as Avery said, it's going to become more and more prevalent. You're going to run into more and more people who call themselves Satanists. So just getting a little understanding of what they believe. They don't worship Satan really. Okay, they're more atheistic and really human focused, following their own desires and their own wishes and those things.
All right, speaking of someone following their own desires and worshiping self, next one comes from Christian Headlines. Trans influencer Dylan Mulvaney says sex assigned at birth was not what God had in mind. So I'm sure most of you have heard at this point of Dylan Mulvaney. He's a very influential TikTok influencer, got over 10 million followers for his whole 365 days of girlhood, as he calls it. He's been doing a tour going around talking about his experience. And one of the things that he has said in a video that he published on his social media was, speaking about God, he said, "I don't think God, made a mistake with me."
Flag. Got to throw the heresy flag on that one. Okay.
Got a heresy flag. All right.
Because I agree, but I disagree. Okay? I don't think God made a mistake either. And the quote goes on to say, I don't think he made a mistake. God made a mistake with me. And that maybe one day I will actually be grateful for being trans, that this isn't some curse, but it's just a different path to the same destination, whatever that means. So I watched some video this weekend that he's released on social media of how he grew up in a socially conservative religious home, and he's trying to cling to his Christianity, but the hateful things people are saying are making that hard. I think the hateful things people are saying are maybe not necessarily hateful, but the truth that the Bible claims that God created us male and female from the beginning. And that's why we need to throw the heresy flag on claims like this. God didn't make a mistake. God created Dylan Mulvaney a male, and that was not assigned at birth, as we often hear claimed. It was revealed as he was born, and that was made known to us, but God created him that way. And it wasn't a mistake. That was God's intention. And that's how he was intended to live. The mistake was him choosing to live as a woman and to dress differently and to undergo different procedures and chemicals. That's the mistake when we choose to rebel against God. And that is part of the curse. That's the curse he needs to recognize in these things. But it's not a curse without hope, because there is redemption in Christ for anyone. And anytime we're struggling with these issues, we think we're in the wrong path. We think we're in the wrong body. We think we're doing the wrong thing. There's always a pathway back to truth, back to being reconciled with God through Jesus Christ in those things.
As we always like to say, the Bible is our only source of truth. And if you don't know someone yet who's struggling with this, I'm pretty sure that you will in some way have a friend or family member, because it's just such almost like a disease that's spreading through this culture.
Yeah.
And science always confirms the Bible. And I thought it was interesting because Dylan actually admits that science was like his best and favorite subject in high school. And I'm thinking, well, you must have missed something in biology, because science confirms Genesis 1:27, right?
Yeah.
Very clearly we can see in the human genome that you're either male or female, you're either an XX or an XY. There is no variation from that. Science confirms exactly what God's word says. But I think the most disturbing thing about this particular individual is that he is, as we say, he says he's transgender, and he is identifying as a girl, though, and not a woman, right? And he is 26 years old, biological male, posting videos of him running around in very girlish clothing with little pigtails and flitting around. There's
to be scared of
obviously
bugs and just
a lot more going on here than just someone trying to identify as another
So for
gender.
me, I have two women on either side of me. So when you see this and you see advertisers using him to promote femininity and womanhood, is that something that's ultimately going to appeal to you?
No.
Absolutely not.
A little hard to relate to seeing a man wearing women's stuff and imagining how that would look. That just, no. And like you were saying, like, it's really interesting. Like, he doesn't say he's on day 365 of womanhood. He says it's day 365 of girlhood. I don't know a single woman who refers to herself as being part of girlhood or like experiencing girlhood. Like, nobody says that. there's like really weird things going on with this man.
Very childlike,
very odd,
inappropriate things going on.
It's the chaos and confusion you get apart from Christ and His Word.
And then we see him getting picked up by products and companies that are associated with women as as their advertisement source, and that's causes such confusion, especially for children when they see things like that.
Yeah, I mean, one of his videos has he's amassed over 1 billion views on his videos. 1 billion. The amount of young people consuming this content and becoming more and more confused about what it means to be a man or a woman. So if as parents, we need to be having conversations with our children about this, because this is the type of content TikTok is pushing to the forefront
and
on
it's
young
getting
people.
Funneled out into other social media, not just
TikTok. Yeah. So definitely be talking to your children about the beautiful design that God has made of us as male or female, and be instilling that foundation and that truth in your children, because the world is trying to instill a very different worldview.
Absolutely.
All right, moving away from culture items, we have a science news item here. Beetles fed on dinosaur feathers 105 million years ago. So this is talking about a find from amber fossils, which are really unique types of fossils, because it's basically a tree resin, captures things, very sticky tree resin, and then when it hardens, you have this 3D fossil with these potentially little things inside, little bits of plants, pollen. In this case, they actually found the larval molts of a little tiny beetle, and little bits of downy feathers. So of course, because we found these little bits of downy feathers in this Cretaceous, early Cretaceous period, they would say, that obviously means there was a theropod dinosaur nearby that shed some
wait a minute. Just because it says dinosaur here in the title, now we know that the evolutionists believe that birds are dinosaurs. They've changed the definition on us, and that's evident right here in the article, because it says it may have been either avian or non-avian. So this is either a bird dinosaur or a non-bird dinosaur. So they've switched the definition on us, so we can't trust the headline right from the beginning. And these feathers are apparently, the story they tried to weave is this was a tree with a nest in it, and these beetles were in there feeding on the feathers left over in the nest,
like they do
which
today.
Is reasonable because they do that today.
Same types of beetles
and
do that today.
they fell off in the resin, and they were trapped together, and we find them there together. So basically we have beetles in a nest eating feathers trapped in resin, just like we have happening today, and we're supposed to believe it's dinosaurs.
I know, especially this particular beetle. I mean, what I found fascinating as a forensic scientist is we look for these types of beetles when dead, decaying things today, because they're attracted to that. God designed them to break down things like feathers, which are keratinized, which are a little more difficult to break down and put back into the ecosystem, and they're feeding on it. It's not surprising. We see the exact same things today. And, it just goes back to the same old narrative. And one of the examples that they give is that, well, we have evidence of nesting here, right? So because we have these nests and we have these feathers, then it must have been dinosaurs. Well, lots of things nest, right? It's not just bird. We would say birds. It's definitely not dinosaurs. They're just birds. There's nothing more than birds. But birds nest, skunks nest, bees nest, right? Alligators nest. Lots of things
evidence
nest.
that dinosaurs are birds, even though they like to use that.
And every example that they even gave at the end of this article, talking about how the fossil evidence confirms that this must have been a dinosaur.
They go on this long trail of explaining all that.
Yes.
Now, we don't disagree with the interpretation of the amber fossil, that this is likely a beetle trapped with the nesting feathers and all of those things.
Yeah.
It's evidence that supports that interpretation, but it doesn't support the idea that birds and dinosaurs are these evolved ancestors.
It's not an unknown
of one another.
theropod dinosaur feather.
No, it's
Avian or non-avian. We
bird
don't know.
nest, and we have these downy feathers, likely from the chicks of this bird that, after it had hatched, caught in the resin, and we have an example of that just like we could find today.
Mm-hmm. Which is less exciting than the headline.
Yeah,
If
throw
they
a
had
dinosaur
said,
in the headline.
they had
No
said
dinosaurs
feeding
involved
on
in the
bird
story
feathers,
whatsoever.
they
Just
wouldn't
in the
have read it.
imagination.
Yeah.
All right. This next one comes from the Smithsonian Magazine. When did clothing originate?
Oh, I know. But I don't think that's the answer they're going to give us here.
That's not the answer they're going to give. I think I know the answer you're going to give, and it's not the one in here. So clothing, we don't really have any clothing from people that lived during the Ice Age or anything like that. In their view, that would be a very long time ago, tens of thousands of years ago. And they're saying, well, clothing hasn't really lasted that long, but it was really, really cold. So we're going to assume people probably wore clothing. So they started to look for some like other evidence, like sewing needles, things like that, in order to get circumstantial evidence that yes, they were making and wearing clothing and not dying of hypothermia. So they think that clothing started to emerge basically because people were cold and they put clothes on because they were cold. And then over time they developed more complex clothing, and then they started to decorate and ornament the clothing, and then it sort of stuck around as a cultural artifact. So even when it got warmer again, people still wore the clothing because they'd gotten used to it and gotten used to
They felt
putting
pretty in it.
things
They-
on it.
Yeah,
They
they're
look
kind of
nice.
insinuating, they felt better, they liked the way they looked, so they kept wearing clothes.
Yeah, so this goes back to we're going to interpret evidence based on our worldview.
Yep.
So this man is telling the story from his evolutionary worldview. If we believe that ape-like creatures, and they go back to 800,000 years ago with Peking man and this hominin species, that these hominins have all evolved over time, and we get these caveman creatures, and then eventually we're evolving more human-like, so we go into the Stone Age period, and then the Bronze Age period, and the Iron Age. So there's this mythology that they've developed that talks about technological advancement through the ages, and we get more and more advanced. They're saying clothing advanced along that same trajectory, and we had technological advancements that gave us the ability to do different things. Well, if you're starting from that framework, that's how you're going to look for evidence and interpret evidence, because everyone has a worldview. As our friend Bill Jack says, everyone has a bias, which is the best bias to be biased by. And we'd look at this same evidence and say, no, these are just people who had to make do with what they had after the scattering from Babel. They had limited technology and limited resources, and they didn't have the opportunity to develop a lot of those things quickly. And when we look to Scripture, we have a pretty clear answer to this question that is at the heading of this article. When did
Yes.
clothing originate? And it's right there at the beginning of Genesis, because God clothed Adam and Eve with tunics of skin.
Yeah,
and
they
from
sinned,
there on
they
out,
felt
that
naked, they
was it.
felt exposed, they realized they had sinned against God, and so he, makes the first sacrifice, basically, and clothes them.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why that we wear clothes today. It has
Yeah.
nothing to do with being cold. It's a direct
And actually,
result of
it was
sin.
Adam and Eve who made the first clothing.
Yeah, they tried to cover their own
They tried
sin.
to cover their own sin, their own shame with fig leaves. And God basically said, your attempts to cover your sin are not good enough.
Amen.
I need to do it for you. There needs to be a blood sacrifice. And all of that was to point us forward to the ultimate blood sacrifice that would come with Jesus Christ, the perfect Lamb of God, who would shed his blood once for all and provide that perfect atonement for sin. So where did clothing originate? With God's plan to cover our sin. And that's why nakedness is shameful, because it's part of the curse and part of the fall into sin.
And I
Not
think
because
I
of our
think
psychological
I would say
problems.
the positive side of this article, because the archaeological evidence I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
They
them
actually were
finding-
able to conduct experiments on some
Yep.
of the artifacts that they found, and they worked in actually creating holes into skins and things like that to actually sew together different types of fabric. It shows, once again, that humans were extremely intelligent in our past, and they used the resources that God provided to cover themselves.
Yeah,
So-
and eventually they say, instead of wanting to have things to just cover ourselves up for warmth, they wanted it for appearance and looks. So instead of having Louis Vuitton, they had Louis Caveton back then, I guess. Sorry, I couldn't resist myself.
You got a couple chuckles anyway. All right, the next one comes from Science Daily. Algae in Swedish lakes provide insights to how complex life on Earth developed. So this was looking at everyone's most favorite, most exciting research subject, the amazing algae.
I love looking at algae in the microscope. So much fun.
Well, they were looking at green algae in these lakes in Sweden, and they were trying to look at basically a cost-benefit analysis of 3 different organizational strategies that these algae have, of either being on their own, being together in a group, or at times being together in a group and at times being alone. And they were looking at that to try and get an idea of how a single-celled organism developed multicellularity to be able for life to continue to evolve. And shockingly, they didn't really get any answers in their
They
study.
found out algae is algae.
Algae is algae, and it acts like
still
algae, and
algae.
it makes more algae.
Yeah.
So if we want to understand the evolutionary story of life, we had to get from primordial chemicals that organize themselves into a cell, and then those single-celled organisms then had to become multicellular like us that are more complex. And so what they're trying to do here is take something in the present that's single-celled and trying to understand how that might have organized itself into multicellular things in the past. And so these algae, which are really fascinating, I just ordered some today to study.
As
next
we
week.
do.
Don't you guys
Order algae.
I did. So anyway.
It is cool under the microscope, I'll give you that.
Anyway.
It is way cooler
it
under a
is,
microscope
yeah.
than stuck to your foot while
Yes,
you're trying
yes.
to swim in a lake.
Yes.
So I'll give you that, Roger.
All right. So the idea here is that if sometimes these algae are single-celled and sometimes multi-celled, and there are conditions in the environment that can cause them to work together, then maybe that's what caused them billions of years ago to start to work together and become multicellular. But that's just a story about the past. And the ones that we have today that are sometimes single-celled and sometimes working together, we call them colonial organisms.
They're not even multicellular.
They're not even multicellular. There has to be a radical change in the DNA to change them from making single-celled organisms to make multicellular ones that have different cell types and tissues that do different functions. So what they did isn't even what they claim to have done in this study. All they did is showed colonialism, not multicellularism.
Yeah.
So it's not even accurate to portray what had to happen in the past. So a bit of a bait and switch in the article. Didn't accomplish what they said they did.
All right, the next one comes from LifeSite News. Slim majority of Americans now doubt that humans are responsible for climate change, according to this poll. So this was actually really interesting. Looking at a recent poll conducted within the University of Chicago, and they found by a group within the University of Chicago, and they found that belief in humans causing all or most climate change, and of course that's the prevailing narrative that we hear from the media all the time, has slumped in America to 49% from the 60% level recorded just 5 years ago, which is a pretty significant drop, 11% in just 5 years of this idea that all or most climate change is being caused by humans. And that's really quite surprising because the media works extremely hard all the time to make sure we know that everything is just going crazy, we're ruining the earth, we're destroying everything.
By 2023, everything's going to be in shambles.
And then they just move the goalpost a little bit further into the future. By 2030.
Erase those tweets.
Yeah, go back and delete that. That didn't age super well. So that was interesting. The other thing I thought was interesting about this is they actually asked people how much money they'd be willing to spend to combat climate change.
Put your money where your mouth is.
Exactly. And they found that 70% of Americans are unwilling to spend more than $2.50 a week.
Can't
So
even get
clearly,
a coffee for that
even
much.
those who really view this as an issue aren't really willing to spend a ton of money
That's
on
definitely
this.
more than I spend.
Yeah,
I wouldn't
that's
even
true.
spend $2.50.
That's true.
Yeah.
But the programs that the governments of various Western nations are proposing to fight climate change are going to cost you an awful lot more than $2.50 a week. They're going to cost trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars with very little benefit. But yeah, I thought this was really interesting to see this drop in belief in this.
Yeah, so all the alarmism that's been raised by various groups and organizations that are trying to promote this idea that the world is headed toward drastic, a freezing wave. Back in the 70s, we heard that the next ice age is coming, and then
That
it
didn't
shifted
happen.
to global warming was the big fear when I was in high school. And then it changed to climate change as a big catch-all to cover all of that. People haven't seen those things happening. And in fact,
They're still polar bears, and they're doing great.
they're doing great, and they're able to adapt to those things, and people are understanding that there are more things as we study things like the carbon dioxide cycle and the saturation points of those things. Various scientists are actually looking at those things over longer periods of time. We can't look at climate as detailed as they claim. We can't look at the ice cores and see the things in the detail that they claim to be able to. And people, I think, are just waking up to those things and realizing it's not as detailed and the analysis isn't as accurate as we think it is.
Hence why they keep getting things wrong.
We're seeing all the wrong predictions
Yeah.
over and over and over and over. Al Gore had his video, An Inconvenient Truth, which has become an inconvenient truth, ironically, because none of those predictions have come true. And people see those failed predictions, and they're seeing the light in those things.
I think what I found the most positive part of this, I thought was fantastic, was that actually it's the younger generation that is losing their faith in climate change. They actually said between the ages of 18 and 29, there was a 17% decline in those individuals that supported the climate change agenda. And the article does point out, faulty data, and that there's lots of skepticism about, these professionals that are coming out saying that there's evidence for this climate change. So I thought that was very positive. They said people over 60, there was only a 9% drop, but it was actually the younger ones.
Yeah, which is really interesting because they're the ones who are the most.
I think that's something positive, right?
Yeah.
We see there for sure is that.
And God's promised He's going to uphold His creation until
That's
Christ
Genesis
returns.
8.
And Genesis 8. So we can trust His word, and these things are going to remain for us. That doesn't mean we abuse the climate. That doesn't mean we aren't good stewards. But that doesn't mean we need to live in
right? We're supposed
fear.
to take care of it.
It doesn't mean we live fearful.
Yeah, and what's interesting is we were talking about how they've had all these predictions. The glaciers are all going to have melted by year whatever, and then that year came and glaciers are still there. But part of that is because all of this is based on computer modeling. And if you put the wrong data or not fully accurate data, or you're missing things into your computer model, the result that the computer spits out is not going to be accurate. And so if you think about climate data, they've been taking temperature measurements in land-based weather stations for just over 100 years or so. Well, that's only so accurate because you can only have so many, and the daily weather is going to make a difference. So they started doing satellite data back in the 70s, and that's much better. But that still gives us only about 50 years of robust, good data. And even that has problems. And the computer models that they use to do all this aren't able to accommodate all of the parameters like cloud cover and things like that make a really big difference. And so there's just different things going on in the computer models that end up giving bad results. But they're basing policy and all these different decisions that big groups are making and big governments are making off of models that just have not had accurate predictions. And a lot of that has to do with the data that's going in is just not accurate, or there isn't enough of it yet, and things like that. So those are some of the problems with it. And it's good to see people waking up and kind of realizing that. All right, well, we are out of time, so we're just going to wrap up with a couple of just things we want to highlight for you here. One is that we have happening this summer down at the Ark Encounter, the world's largest Christian music festival, 40 days and 40 nights. I think this is year 3?
Is it 3? I think it's...
Couple years. We've been doing this down at the Ark, and it's been going, it's been amazing. People love it. People have been really enjoying it. So it's August 1st to September 9th. What's really cool is all of the concerts, there's 150 or 120 different concerts, 150 different artists. They are all free with your daily admission. So when you come and you visit the Ark, you get to take in all those concerts that are happening that day.
Or you get the bouncer pass, and then you get 3 days, and you can bounce
or
back
an ultimate
and forth.
bouncer pass. You can come as many times as you want. Lots of ways to enjoy that. Another music event happening is our Faith, Country, and Bluegrass Festival coming to the Ark Encounter, and that'll be June 14th to the 17th. Different artists are coming to perform down at the Ark, and again, all of those concerts are free with your Ark Encounter admission. So really exciting. If you enjoy faith, country music, bluegrass music, be sure to check out those events and make your plans to come and visit us. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back again. Next week is homeschool experience, correct? I'm
Yes.
right about that. So there will not be
Yes.
Answers News next
Yes,
week
that's
because
correct.
everyone is super busy with homeschool experience. So we will be back the following week to join you for Answers News. Thank you so much.
God bless.